How the Soviet Union, and by extension all countries influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution from China, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, Angola, Mozambique, Yemen, etc., have betrayed not only socialism but embraced capitalism in a most perverted form. A study by a anarchist think tank, Center for Stateless Society, written by Kevin Carson, the Undeclared Condominium, the USSR as Partner in a Conservative World Order. Although the right has typically framed the Soviet Union and international communism as an aggressive and subversive revolutionary force, the reality is, at the very least, considerably more nuanced. In fact, it would be more accurate to describe the USSR's relation with the West over most of its history as collusive. He has facilitated capitalist states, repression, and revolutionary forces far more than has backed such forces. The Soviet Union foreign policy certainly went through a heavy phase of anticipation and international revolution by the years immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution. But following the failure of these revolutionary impulse, with the Spartakists in Germany, serving to Maximalists in Vienna, and the Soviet regime in Bavaria, and the Bela Kun in Hungary in 1990, and the catastrophic alliance of the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang in 1927, which in fact had its own, even though it was a fascist party, had a left-wing faction, the Left Kuomintang, although still maintained very anti-capitalist sentiments. The same thing with Nazi Germany, who had a quote-unquote left-wing faction called the Stratovist faction, having a more anti-capitalist, more social democratic approach. And the same thing happened to other similar groups, like the Italian Fascist Party, where the National Syndicalists, who took heavy inspiration from socialist and anarchist thinking without actually embracing them. They were always the first to be eliminated in these fascist movements. His relation to the outside world took a considerable different character. This partly owing to Stalin's combined caution and authoritarianism, and partly to the situation the USSR gave the stabilization of Bolshevik rule and failure of revolution abroad. The exact apportionment of causation is debatable, and indeed has been extensively debated. In the case of the role of the Soviet Union, global affair was contrary to anti-communist ideological characterization, comparatively conservative. In functional terms, the USSR acted more to constrain foreign revolutionary powers subject to its control than to aid them, and in the process helped to promote domestic stability in Western countries. This was true of the Soviet Union's relationship with the multipolar world from the late 1920s until World War II, and even more true of its antipolar relationship with the United States for the wartime alliance of the 1940s through its political suicide in 1991. In the period immediately after World War II, in particular, America and Britain needed and got Stalin cooperation to restore capitalism in Western Europe. Remember, Stalin wanted to be the fourth Axis ally, joining forces with the fascists. But Hitler's scream anti-communism and dominance for world governance prevented this alliance to happen. For the reasons of length, I will choose not to include a considerable amount of material that would have been relevant to a broader understanding of the bipolar dynamic. In particular, I focus on the post-World War II role of the United States to neglect the history of decolonization and subsequent neocolonial policies by other Western countries. The extreme violence by Great Britain, Kenya, and the Congo by Belgium during the decolonization process, the extractive trade relationship between France and its former West African colonies, and the way European countries of colonial regime the essentialization of sectarian and tribal differences to rule through officials like India's Saminanders and by elevating them to positions far beyond their judicial authority, affected their post-independence viability, would have aided a great deal to this study. In the International Civil War between 1917 to 1927, according to Eric Hobsbawm, the Russian Revolution in the decades after 1917 cast a shadow over the world comparable to cast over 19th century Europe by the French. It greatly exceeded the influence of French Revolution, intersects Marxist-Leninism, and to be more specific, Stalinism and later Maoism, was by far the most formidable organization for revolutionary movement in modern history. In this period, the ideological politics can best be understood as a secular struggle by the forces of the old guard against social revolution, politically embodied in, allied with, or dependent on the fortunes of the Soviet Union and international communism. Arnold Mayer described in great detail the way Bolshevism had threatened to spread on over heads of the parties assembled at the Paris peace talks in 1918 and 19. In the events of the armistice was created just in time to limit the political consequence of military defeat in Central and East Central Europe to less than revolutionary proportions. But even with this 11-hour finish of the legacy of disruption and convulsion was far more negligible. Granted, neither Germany nor Austria went Spartacus, and Hungary remained Bolshevik for only 133 days. But the fact remains that there were great disorders, rebellions, and strikes throughout the theater of Europe, normally because politicians and labor leaders had ready-made organizational weapons which to capitalize on political instability, unemployment, shoe shortages, and runaway prices. Throughout the final days of the war and the negotiation in Paris, the Western Allies were haunted by the specters of Bolshevism in Central Europe. There was a real fear that the Spartakists would achieve control in Germany and revolutionary socialists would come to power in Vienna, Bohemia, and Budapest. In Western Allies' approach concerted to take the revolution east of the Rhine tend to take precedence over the settlement of diplomatic scores. Despite serious differences in national interests between the Allies, the Paris Peace Conference made a host of decisions, all of which in varying degrees were designed to check Bolshevism. The victors made territorial concessions to Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, for helping to stem the revolutionary tide beyond their own borders. They gave military assistance and economic aid to these and other borderlands as well as to the Whites for their armed assault of the Soviet Union and Hungary. They stepped up their direct military intervention in Russia. They rigorously enforced the blockade against Bolshevik Russia and Hungary, and they rushed economic assistance to Austria and successor states to help to stabilize their governments. And they drafted the charter of the International Labour Organization, or the ILO, and the League of Nations with a view to immunizing the non-Bolshevik left against the ideological bacillus of the Bolshevik Revolution. Some of these measures constitute defense containment policy, a cordon sanitaire calculated to prevent the revolution from spreading beyond Bolshevik controlled areas. Other measures were aimed at the outright overthrow of Lenin and Belagun, but all alike were decided, orchestrated, sanctioned, or condoned by the peacemakers in Paris. At the time, the outcome of this first round of international civil war of the 20th century seemed to be very much in balance. Lloyd George was typical of the Allied mindset of the period of panic after Bela Kun's accession to power. His greatest fear was that Germany might yet fail to Spartacus and ally itself with Soviet Russia, which case the outcome would be Spartacism from the Urals to the Rhine. And from the perspective of Western leaders, the fear was reasonable. Workers' and soldiers' councils in the first months of 1990 appeared throughout German cities as well as in Budapest and Vienna, although the strength of the Spartakists and other maximalist or pro-Bolshevik parties in them was at best uneven. Spartacism continued to smolder in Germany even after the violent suppression of the Council Republic in Berlin by the Third Corps, and in the meantime, Soviet regimes appeared in Hungary and Bavaria, and for a time appeared imminent in Austria. The Bolshevik managed served as a useful domestic function as well as justifying the repression not only of domestic radicalism and dissidents of all kinds, but of even liberal reformism. There are numerous indicators that the clamor for permanent peace was stirred up as part of a political design. Except for the proto-fascist New Right, the leaders, parties, and pressure groups, and patriotic leagues and newspapers that sparked this agitation also favored rigorously conservative or outright reactionary social and economic policy. In fact, the forces, in order to appear to have taken advantage of the intoxication of victory, either to preserve or advance their class interests and status, positioned under an ideological cover which was syncretism of jingoist, nationalist, baleful, anti-Wilsonian, and rabid anti-Bolshevism. However, was not a super patriot, was denounced as a fellow traveler of the Bolsheviks and stood accused not only of disloyalty but also of advocating a sellout peace. The revolutionary segment of socialist and labor movements were not the primary target of the jingoist anti-Bolshevik campaign. It was just to rout and disconcert the very core of the forces of change. To do so now, preemptive, before the vast growing left had chance to rally around Wilson and to make political gains from the high cost of living, raising taxes, and the strain of reconversion. In addition, championship of Wilsonian pace, this non-communist left, was battling for the 48-hour work week, collective bargaining, graduate income taxes, and social welfare measures that avowed principles of self-determination embodied quite inconsistent in the provision of the Versailles regime if they were relying on the Allies' unsuccessful proxy war against Soviet Russia through Kolkach and Denikin, and their successful one against the coup regime through Romania and the Slovaks. Meanwhile, The exigencies of the International Civil War served to legitimate authority on the Bolshevik side as well. Relatively soon after the October Revolution, the Revolutionary Growth Crusade was combined with an increased attempt to subdue world revolutionary forces, particularly at the left outside of Russia, under Bolshevik control through the Third or Communist International. This made a certain kind of sense. Hofstadter argued only on the assumption that the revolutionary wave was forthcoming in the West and the international left was to be disciplined as a vanguard force under Soviet leadership, despite the fact that in the Russian Revolution itself they never practiced vanguardism or democratic centralism at all, despite the rhetoric. It was in 1920 that the Bolsheviks committed themselves to what is retrospectively seen a major error: permanent division of international labor movement. They did so by structuring their new international communist movement on the pattern of Leninist vanguard party of an elite of full-time professional revolutionaries. The October Revolution had won wide sympathies in the international socialist movement, virtually all of which emerged from the World War, both radicalized and enormously strengthened. With rare exceptions, the socialists and Labour parties contained large bodies of opinion they favored joining the new Third or Communist International, which the Bolsheviks found to replace the Second International. Discredited and broken by the World War, he had failed to resist. Indeed, several such as the Socialist Party of France, Italy, Austria, and Norway, and the Independent Socialists of Germany actually voted to do so, leaving the unreconstructed opponents of Bolshevism in minority. Yet what Lenin and the Bolsheviks wanted was not an international movement of socialist sympathizers with the October Revolution, but a corps of utterly committed and disciplined activists, a sort of global striking force for revolutionary conquest. Parties unwilling to adopt the Leninist structure were refused to admit it to or expelled from New International, which could only be weakened by accepting such thick columns of opportunism and reformism. Not to mention that Marx has once called parliamentary criticism. The argument made sense on only one condition: that the world revolution was still in progress, and its battle were in imminent prospect. Yet while the European situation was far from stabilized, it was clear in 1920 that Bolshevik revolution was not an agenda in the West, though it was clear that Russia the Bolsheviks were permanently established. The Bolsheviks still retained a hope for revolutionary success in Asia until the failure of the Kuomintang and CCP alliance and Jiang Shenshin's suppression of the communists. Yet even before this proved that even the East was now yet ripe for October, the promise of Asia do not conceal the failures of the revolution of the West. By 1921, this was undeniable. The revolution was in retreat in Soviet Russia, through political Bolshevik power was unassailable. It was off the agenda in the West. The Third Congress of Committee recognized this without quite admitting that by calling the United Front with the every socialist from the second after expelled from the army of revolutionary progress. Just what this meant was to divide the revolutionaries with the next generation. However, in any case, it was too late. The movement was permanently split. The majority of the left socialists, individuals, and parties drifted back into social democratic movements, overwhelmingly led by anti-communist moderates. The new communist parties remained minority in European left, and generally, with a few exceptions such as Germany, France, or Finland, rather small if impassionate minority. Their situation was not changed until the 1930s. In fact, like I mentioned earlier, many cases where fascists and the Marxists joined forces. For example, I already mentioned about left-wing factions within fascist parties. Like fascist Italy, you have the national syndicalist groups who were still anti-communist but had more of a social democratic leaning to it, heavily influenced by socialist and anarchist thinkers without actually subscribing to anarchism because they still believe in hierarchy, which is the complete opposite of anarchism. But there, it is what it is. Before Mussolini persecuted them once he took power. The same thing to Nazi Germany when there was the Straterist reaction and the original paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party was heavily involved with the Straterist faction, who were more anti-capitalist, socialistic, more like social democratic leaning group, and they were the first to be eliminated by Hitler in the Night of the Long Knives. And the same thing with China with the Kuomintang, where you had the Kuomintang left, who were persecuted by the Shanghai Massacre by the longest reigning fascist ruler in history, Chiang Kai-shek. At the same thing, Joseph Stalin wanted to be the fourth Axis power, joining the forces with the Axis, but Hitler's racism prevented it from happening. And like similar things has happened before like that. So it's like it is what it is, I guess. For example, in the early years of the Nazi Party, many cases of the German communists and Nazis were joining forces to do walkouts against the parliament, for example. Or they joined forces to eliminate the anarchists, like what happened in Korea, and what happened in Spain, and what happened in Ukraine, and what happened in many other places similar to this. So there's that. So like that's the best I could say. It was also becoming increasingly evident by 1990 with the suppression of the Spartakists of the Bavarian Soviet government in Germany, the failure of the Council uprising in Vienna, and the later collapse of the Belarusian regime in Hungary. The Soviet Russia would have to function as a nation state with an international state system dominated by capitalist power. The defeat of the British general strike in 1926 and Xi'an's massacre of Chinese Communist Party in 1927 made it completely clear. Yet the years of upheaval left behind not only a single huge but backward country not governed by communists and committed to the building of an alternative system of capitalism, but also a government of disciplined international movement and perhaps equally important, a generation of revolutionaries committed to the vision of the world revolution under the flag raised in October and under the leadership of the movement which inevitably had its headquarters in Moscow. The movement may now have known quite how the world revolution was to advance after stabilizing Europe and defeating Asia, after the communists' scattered attempts and independent armed insurrections were disasters. The normalization of Russia and the trial of conservatism between 1927 to 1941 may characterize the relation between the Soviet Russia and West was an international civil war. Was technically accurate through the 1920s or so. It was generally international civil war with the goal of war revolution on one side and counter-revolution on the other side. It will it will down with a series of events, including the consolidation of Soviet power and defeat of the White armies, and the failure of revolutionary projects, and more or less ended the recognition of the USSR as a member of the Westphalian nation-state system. From the 1920s on, there was a continued political and ideological competition between the capitalist West and the Soviet regime, but it was kind of controlled competition that prevailed in oligopoly markets, which the relationship is cultivated and mutually supported as a competitive. Gabriel Kolko argued there was an internal division of the international socialist movement before and during the war that left a vacuum for Lenin to fill, and the resulting deep split in the movement between communists and social democrats was the cause of socialist failure in the interwar period. Politically, the fact that the French and German and Italian socialist parties were all suffering from grave internal contradictions produced a historic vacuum that was to prove fatal to world socialism, because the socialist parties and unions provide insufficient, if any, leadership to anti-war sentiment within their nations. They produce a vital vacuum in Europe and world socialism that Lenin and the Soviet Communist Party easily filled. There was no consistency or coherence in Lenin's miraculous concept of nation of the party and the road to power, much less the form of socialist society, and in this domain he was no less a pure opportunist than a social democrat, tailoring his position to the potential of the moment in order to grasp power. But Lenin was virtually the only European socialist leader who unequivocally damned the war and the imperialist claims of all nations. It was the purity of this opposition alone that attracted a sufficient core of adherents to allow the permanent historic schism to emerge within the world socialist movement and to preordain its political importance on immovable countries for at least 2 decades. Russia's relation with the left in Western countries was at best ambivalent during much of the interwar period, at times one of the outright abandonment, enemy, or betrayal. Houseworth's remark on the impurity of the Comintern switched into rhetorical mode of ultra-revolutionaries and sectarian leftism between 1928 and 1934, considered that in practice the movement neither expected nor prepared for taking power anywhere. The change which provides political calamities is to be explained by the internal politics of the Soviet Communist Party as Stalin looked control of it, and perhaps also attempt to compensate for the increasingly evident divergence between the interests of the USSR as a state which inevitably had coexist with other states, which began to win international recognition as a regime from 1920, and the movement whose aim was to subvert and overthrow all other governments. In the end, the state interests of the Soviet Union prevailed over the world revolution interest in Communist International, which Stalin reduced to an instrument of Soviet state policy under strict control of the Soviet Communist Party, purging, dissolving, and reforming its competence at will. War revolutions belong to the rhetoric of the past, and indeed any revolution was tolerated only if it did not conflict with the Soviet state interest and could be brought under direct Soviet control. This latter fact in particular became even more evident in the last days of World War II and the early post-war period, as Stalin not only as they used the Eastern European communist regime as a naked extension of Soviet power, but discouraged independent communist efforts, even though which proved successful, as in Yugoslavia and in China. The influence not only of the Soviet example, but the communist activists that inspired the other countries meant that the old left was largely dominated by Marxist-Leninism. So in the generation after 1917, Bolshevism absorbed all other social revolutionary traditions, or pushed them on the margins of radical movements before 1914 anarchism, and been far more the driving ideology of revolutionary activists than Marxists over the large parts of the world. Marx outside Eastern Europe was seen rather as a guru of mass parties whose inedible but not explosive advance to victory he had demonstrated. By 1930s, anarchism had ceased to exist as a significant political force outside Spain, and even then it was crushed by the combined might of the communists, the socialists, the fascists, and nationalists, the combined external support from Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Italian fascists to crush the anarchists. Even Latin America, where the black and red had traditionally inspired more militants than the red flag, even in Spain, the Civil War was to destroy anarchism, which made the fortunes of communists hereafter relatively insignificant. In short, to be social revolutionary increased meant to be a follower of Lenin in the October Revolution, and increasingly a member or supporter of some Moscow-aligned Communist Party, although more so when, after the triumph of Hitler in Germany, these parties adopted the policy of anti-fascist union, which allowed them to emerge from sectarian isolation and to win mass support among both workers and intellectuals. The young who thirsted to overthrow capitalists became orthodox communists and identified their cause with the Moscow-centered international movement. The irony, Hobsbawm noted, is that the virtual complete takeover of the social revolutionary tradition came at a time when the Soviet Union had plainly abandoned its revolutionary optimism of 1917 to 1923. From 1935 onwards, the literature of the critical left was filled with the accusation of Moscow's movements missed, rejected, and they betrayed the opportunities for revolution because Moscow did not want it anymore. The commentary strategy not only hobbled the political influence of foreign communist parties, but also counterproductive and to facilitate Hitler's rise to power. So far from the initiation of another round of social revolution, the Communist International expects the depression reduced the international communist movement outside the USSR to a state of unprecedented feebleness. This was immediately due to some measure to the suicidal policy of the Comintern, which not only grossly underestimated the dangers of National Socialism in Germany, but pursued a policy of sectarian isolation that seemed quite incredible in retrospect. By 80 that its main enemy was the organized mass labor movement of Social Democrats, a labor party described as social fascist. In Europe of 1934, only the French Communist Party still had a genuine political presence. This went so far in 1933 Moscow that the Italian Communist leader P. Togliatti withdraw the suggestion that perhaps social democracy was not the primary danger, at least in Italy, but that Hitler had actually come to power. The coverage did not change his line until 1934. In France, the Communist Party only reluctantly joined other forces of the left against the right-wing power grab, and did so in violation of Comintern policy. In February 1934, the far-right called demonstration against the deadliest left-of-center government, planned to invade the Chamber of Deputies and enforce right-wing government by force. A night of vicious fighting followed as demonstrators and police shot at one another with a total of 15 deaths and 1,435 wounded. The leader resigned the next day, fearing he could no longer keep order, and right of center radical replaced him. The far right has shown it had the strength to unmask a government by force, and France seemed to be set allowed the path of Italy and Germany. At first, French communists gave little indication that any effort to abandon the strategy of sectarian isolation, and the German communists had pursued leading up to Hitler's seizure of power. The French left had previously seen as incapable of responding as the left elsewhere. The communists repeated the third period nonsense of the Socialist Party were social fascists. But at the last minute, when they responded to CGT, or the Confederation General du Travail, called for a general strike with demonstration of their own, but separate from other organizations. Surprisingly, as CGT and the Communist Party demonstrated too close together, people began chanting the same anti-fascist slogan, melting into a single demonstration. The success of the general strike and the united demonstration halted the right's advances. A former agreement between communists and socialists led to gains from both in election expenses of the radicals. Then the Communist Party went even further in its policy shift. It called for a pact, not just for the socialists, but for the radical party as well, on the ground that although it was a bourgeois party, it stood for preserving the republic. However, the mood in the streets and workplace was much more impressive than the socialist radical government. After all, two parties had held enough seats in parliament to have formed such a government at any point in the previous 4 years. A series of huge left-wing demonstrations culminated in a 600,000-strong commemoration of the Paris Commune, an anarchist society. Biggest wave of strike France has ever known was beginning, and even before Blanc's government took office. The employers who had been willing to look favorably in the advances of the far right only 2 years before, were now desperate for Blanc to settle the strike, even if it meant making enormous concessions of the workers. Among many workers, there was feeling they wanted more than just wage increase, a shorter working week, and holidays. They wanted somehow to change society in its entirety. At this point, the Communist Party returned to its characteristic form, refusing to exploit the momentum on the left and instead seeking a reformist deal with the bourgeois parties. The strike continued until June 11, when the Communist Party intervened with the speeches by its leader, Maurice Torres. He claimed the sense to seize power now is out of the question. It only did do so was to return and it's necessary to know how to end a strike, he said. Thiers was right that conditions were not yet right for workers to take power, any more than right in February or even July 1917, but there was such a communist who had put into effort the slogan they had virtually raised until only 2 years before, for the creation of Soviets, structures of workers' delegates, which would oversee and challenge the power of the state and big businesses. However, Torres did not even mention this, although the mood of workers would ensure a favorable reception for such a call. The reason particularly came from outside of France. While the Commodore ceased to denounce social democrats as social fascists and had to become encouraged units at the United Front against fascism, Stalin still looked at a conservative approach of pursuing broad unity with the bourgeois liberal parties, even to the extent of forcing communists to renounce radical opportunities. The abandonment of the absurd third period policy had depended on the change in Comintern thinking in Moscow, as had the adoption of the policy of Popular Front alliance with the bourgeois pro-capitalist parties. Stalin wanted foreign policy ally to cement a defense pact with the USSR signed by the right of center level government in 1935. Communist support for a liberal capitalist government seemed to make such an alliance easier. The Comintern accordingly argued that it was only a practical way of blocking the path of fascism. The same approach by Stalin and the Comintern suppressed radicalism on the left in order to make common cause with liberal capitalist forces, was repeated in Spain, and arguably led Franco to victory. Chris Hammer, whose impression of Stalinism we should keep in mind, are no doubt colored by the fact that he was not merely a Trotskyite but apparently a Scotchmanite of some sort. Note that while the Spanish Communist Party had been founded on a decade and a half earlier, the counter-lag of politics of the anarcho-syndicalists and the reformism of the Socialist Party. Successive exposure had driven from the party any leaders who might question the line coming from Stalin in Moscow, and the line was now to promote a popular front with the bourgeois Republicans. When the CNT and the Socialist Party left ditch about what to do with the government, the Communist Party and the Russian ambassador urged them to join a coalition government, abjure talk of revolution, and restrict themselves to purely Republican anti-fascist policies. They argued this would be when support of the middle class stopped all the capitalists and landowners going over to the fascists, and by look in favor by the French and British government. It will also be able to unite members of the various militias into a single centralized army under the command of those professional officers who had stuck by the Republic. Hobbes was second this assessment. Both the Spanish government and, more to the point, the communists who were increasingly influential in its affairs, insisted that social revolution was not their object, and indeed basically did what they could to control and reverse it. Revolution, both insisted, was not the issue, the defense of democracy was. George Orwell likewise noted that the Communist Party, with Soviet Russia behind it, had thrown its whole weight against the revolution. It was the Communist thesis that revolution at its stage would be fatal and was to aim at Spain was not workers' control but bourgeois democracy. Another contemporary account was Rudolf Rocker stated the communists under orders from Moscow and once lined up with the right. They, who previously had never been able to speak contemptuously enough of the CNT and the anarchists because of their petty bourgeois tendencies, suddenly turned defenders not only of the petty bourgeois but of the Spanish big bourgeoisie against the demands of the workers. Immediately after the occurrence of July 1936, the Communist Party had proclaimed the slogan for the Democratic Republic against socialism, As early as August 8 of last year, the Communist deputy Hernandez had violently attacked the CNT in Madrid because of taking over of the industrial plant by worker syndicates, and in connection had declared that after Franco had been beaten, they would soon bring the anarchists to their senses. In Spain, the attacks of the Stalinists were direct, and as all the accomplishment had been born of the events of July 1936. It was they who zealously urged upon the government the suppression of the workers' patrol by the police. It was they who played themselves up as defenders of the middle class in order to turn these workers against workers. The further the great transformation in economic and social life proceeded and brought agriculture and industry under the control of the workers' syndicate, the harder would it be for the old powers to re-establish the old condition. And that was just what foreign capitalists dreaded most, and were seeking by every means to prevent them. But no one had rendered them such a narrow service in this matter as Russian government and its instrument, the Communist Party of Spain. It was they who had anywhere to put most serious difficulties in the way of constructive activities of the workers' syndicate, and who today were annually seeking to destroy a work which is the very greatest importance of social development of a country. The Soviet Union was able to effectively dedicate terms and push the Spanish government to the right because of the position as a major supplier of arms. It was no coincidence that all were noted in the autumn of 1936, when the Soviet Union began to supply arms to the Republic. It was also the beginning of the rightward shift. This strategy of conciliation bourgeois parties with the Republic extended even to forcibly suppress the activism of anarchism and others on the left. However, respect of the private property and maintenance of the old state machine in Spain of autumn of 1936 do not mean merely restraining workers from struggle. It means somehow, by persuading or force, making workers surrender the gains they had made and give up control of the factories and estate they had taken over in July. It meant taking arms away from workers who had stormed the barracks in July and handing them back to officers who had sat on the fence. The Communist Party functionaries and the right-wing socialists argued that any attempt by workers to make social revolution would be a second civil war within the Republican side. Yet their effort to force workers to abandon their social conquest created precisely the enemy of such a civil war. It was they, not the anarchists of the extreme left of Boom, who would choose soldiers at arms from the front in internal issue. It was they who initiated fighting when workers refused to leave collectivized property or obey the orders of the refurbished bourgeois state. It was they who began armed clashes that cost hundreds of lives in Barcelona in May 1937, when they insisted on trying to seize the city telephone building that the CNT militia had conquered from fascists 9.5 months earlier. It was they who unleashed police terror against the left, which involved the murder of our leaders like Andres Nin and the imprisonment of thousands of anti-fascist militants. There was no other way a military working class would be forced to abandon this revolution and wait for the end of the war. As Hobsbawm, somewhat less critical, argued that the Soviet policy in Spain, rather than being a betrayal of revolutionary forces, was consistent with its gradualist approach elsewhere, and that its experience in Spain influenced the initial go-slow approach in Eastern Europe after World War II. The interesting point is that it was not mere opportunism, or as the purists on the ultra-left thought, treason of the revolution. It reflected a deliberate shift from an insurrection into a gradualist, from a confrontation to a negotiation, even a parliamentary way to power, in the light of Spanish people's reaction to the coup, which was undoubtedly revolutionary. Communists could now see how an essential defensive tactic imposed by the desperate situation of their movement after Hitler's accession to power opened perspective of advancement, i.e., a democracy of new type, raising out of the imperative of both wartime politics and economics. Landlords and capitalists who supported the rebels would lose their property, not as landlords and capitalists, but as traders. The government will have to plan and take over the economy, not for reasons for ideology, but for the logic of war economies. As consequently, if victory, such as democracy of a new type, cannot be the enemy of the conservative spirit, it provides guarantee the further economic and political consequence of the Spanish working people. The Comintern pamphlet of October 1936 does describe with considerable accuracy the shape of politics in the anti-fascist war from 1939 to 1945. This was to be a war waged in Europe by all embracing peoples and an all national front government who resisted coalition, which was waged by state managed economies and ended in the occupied territory with massive advances in public sector to the expropriation of capitalists, not as such, but as Germans who collaborated with the Germans. In several countries, Central and Eastern Europe, the world left entirely from anti-fascism to a new democracy, dominated and eventually swallowed by the communists until the outbreak of the Cold War. The object of this post-war regime was quite especially not the immediate conversion to socialist system or the abolition of political pluralism and private property. Examples like that, for example, Japan, before it became a full-on fascist state, there was the Jerry Blossom Society. A secret society was basically one of the first fascist groups in Japan who were influenced by the Soviet Union to some extent, by Iki Kiti, who wanted to establish state socialism, although by his admission, he hated socialism because it was opportunism. But the idea of the state controlling the means of production like the Soviet Union was preferable, turning into a corporation of sorts. This was Comite's policy, as Hartman recalled was repeated yet again in the United States. In the case, forbidding excessive labor radicalism in the interest of combination with FDR. In the following 2 years, 37-39, the CIA added just 400,000 members to those gains in the first 22 months. In 1939, the number of strikes was only half that of 1937. What is more, the union leader increasingly reverted to collaborate with the employers in the strict negotiation by the membership. In the Auto Union, there was an attempt to ban any publication not approved by the leadership, while there were to be no election in the newly formed Steel Union for 5 years. The spontaneous grassroots military scene from 1934 to 36 gave way to the tight control from above. Many activists tried to resist this trend, but as France and Spain, their efforts were made much more difficult by the behavior of the Communist Party. He had played a leading role in the militancy in 34 to 37, with many of his activities taking position as an organizer of the CIO Union Drive, and by their courage and daring have attracted large numbers of recruits. Until 1935, the Communist Party insisted that Roosevelt was a capitalist politician and the New Deal a fraud. Then it made a U-turn and welcomed Roosevelt into the New Democrats with its own version of popular front politics. The party worked with the union leaders to spread illusions about the role of those politicians and the disciplined rank and file trade unionists who might disrupt close relations with the Democrats. This continued for the next 10 years, except for a brief interlude during the Stalin-Hitler Pact at the beginning of the Second World War. It helped the union establish bureaucratic control over most unions, and control which they would use in the 1940s to destroy any communist influence. Its united front strategy had heavily failed to prevent either Hitler's repeated aggression in Central Europe or Chamberlain's deal in Munich. Stalin once again made a 180-degree turn. He abruptly cut his own deal with Hitler, ordered Western Communist Party to cease their efforts to combat fascism. After almost a decade of apparent total failure of the Communist line of anti-fascist unity, Stalin erased from his agenda, at least for the time being, and only came to terms with Hitler, though both sides knew this could not last, but even instructed the international movement to abandon the anti-fascist strategy, a senseless decision perhaps best explained by a provisional aversion to even the slightest risk. Continue in part 2.